House File number 2540, number 2 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to commerce, the second engrossment.
The gentleman from Anoka, Representative Sanders, 2-year bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I want to thank you for taking the time today to discuss House File 2540. What we have right now in Minnesota is almost 1 million Minnesotans that enjoy the community, enjoy the bragging rights, enjoy the opportunity to compete over fantasy sports games. And right now we have a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty in state statute. And with a lot of the happenings that have been going on, a lot of the attention that has come to the issue over the last year or two, I think it's time that Minnesota adds some statutory certainty to fantasy sports games. Like I said, we have almost 1 million Minnesotans that play fantasy sports games. We actually lead the nation in per capita fantasy sports players. This is a very important piece of popular culture and a very important piece of the community here in Minnesota. I think it's important that we have some strong consumer protections in place, that we have some certainty in our statutes so that Minnesotans that choose to play fantasy sports understand that they're legal and that they're operating safely. With that, Mr. Speaker, I do have an amendment.
There is an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Sanders moves to amend House File number 2540, the second engrossment, and the amendment is coded A6.
The gentleman from Anoka to the A6 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And throughout the committee path of this bill and in the larger public, there's been a lot of conversation about consumer protections, what is and isn't daily fantasy, weekly fantasy, and seasonal fantasy sports. So we've amended the bill along the way. I want to thank Representative Atkins for his position on the bill and his persistence in working to make sure that we have good, strong consumer protections. We added some in public safety and in the Commerce Committee, and also wanted to add a few more here today on the House floor. This amendment that you have here in front of you deals with some of the concerns that perhaps there was some anti-competitive issues in fantasy sports. So there's language in here, specifically sections 12 and 13, that help ensure transparency and competition in the marketplace. We've also worked with gaining language with the North Star Problem Gambling Alliance. They've become neutral on the bill with this language in this bill, and I think it's important to understand as well that as we're adding language and some comfort language around compulsive behaviors, compulsive behavior doesn't necessarily mean that it's gambling, or that isn't the only sorts of compulsive behavior. But we felt like it was important enough to add that language in. It matches up with what's happening in the Senate with Senator Pappas as well. So members, I'd ask for your support on the amendment. I want to bring up one last point on the amendment. In current federal law, which does carve out fantasy sports, they go on to mention simulation games and educational games in there as well. And due to some concerns and going way beyond the scope of what the bill was intended to, we want to make sure that we explicitly have statute that are dealing specifically with fantasy sports games. So we are eliminating and deleting simulation and educational games. So with that, members, I'd ask for your support.
Discussion to the A6 amendment. The gentleman from Hennepin. Discussion to the A6 amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Atkins moves to amend House File number 2540, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A4.
I recognize the member from Dakota, Representative Atkins, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Sanders, for your initial amendment. I think that improves the bill. I think this will improve the bill as well. The A4 amendment simply says that these folks would register and be subject to a background check. Minnesota charities and charitable gambling organizations are already subject to this. It seems like a good idea that we would have this, this form of the DFS type activity be subject to background checks and registration as well. With that, I'd appreciate your support.
The member from Anoka, Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Atkins, for bringing the amendment forward. I would say at this time, I'd like to wait on this issue of the registration and see where the Department of Public Safety comes down. I am open to a registration if it's more a notice of operation, or if it follows a similar registration style to, say, filing a business with the Department of Revenue or the Secretary of State. What I'm concerned about is the registration language that ended up, for instance, in the state of Virginia, where they added $50,000 registration fees to their registration. So I'm okay in general with there being a registration. I just want to wait and make sure that we hear back from the Department of Public Safety. We'll have to go to conference with this, but Representative Atkins, if we end up with some assurance from the department, I certainly would not mind adding some similar language to the bill.
The member from Dakota, Representative Atkins.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Sanders. I'm not looking for a $50,000 registration fee either, though whatever is enough to cover expenses, I think, is all I'd be talking about. I think in Nevada, didn't they propose a $5 million licensing fee? I don't know what it was, but I'm not looking at that at all. But with that and with your assurance, I'll withdraw this amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Atkins withdraws the A4 amendment. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Atkins moves to amend House File Number 2540, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A5.
The member from Dakota, Representative Atkins, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Sanders, this one also, the A5 amendment, is something that our charitable gambling organizations are subject to. Its audits. It seems to me that audits provide consumers in Minnesota some level of assurance that these folks are on the up and up. It seems to make a great deal of sense to me, and I'm sure hoping that you'll think it's a good idea as well.
The member from Anoka, Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I would accept this as a friendly amendment.
Any further discussion on the A5 amendment? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the A5 amendment signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. The motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. There is another amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Khan moves to amend House File Number 2540, the second engrossment as amended, and the amendment is coded A13.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Khan, to your amendment.
Yes, Mr. Speaker and members, several times I have actually put in bills to establish sports betting in the state of Minnesota, and without moving very far on it. This would give us the kind of information that we might need by looking at what's going on in other states. Right now, unfortunately, the federal government only allows the states that had established it before they passed a law to do it. It's in, you know, I'm a total non-gambler, and all of my friends are total non-gamblers, but the only thing I know that people do is sports betting. And you can do it online whenever you want to place a bet. You can do it online. I think if you just, if anyone who has a computer on can just Google it right now and see how you could make a sports bet. The estimate that I have is that there are about $14 million of gross sales that were missing in Minnesota. This was a memo that I had written some time ago. I had suggested doing it through a lottery, and that's and the only state that does that is Oregon, whose state lottery has operated sports action game in one form or another since 1989. And it offers pro football betting. At one time, it offered NBA betting. And so looking at that, that's where our numbers of the estimates are. I think that this does not make us do any action. It just makes us look at what we're losing and joins the other states that are interested in pursuing this. So I urge acceptance of the amendment.
The member for Minoka, Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Khan, you are certainly persistent. I figured that once this bill was open for amendments, I would see something from you along these lines. I certainly appreciate the discussion, but members, at this time, I'd ask for a no vote. This just clearly goes well beyond the scope of the bill and where we're trying to go with it. Thank you, members.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Khan.
Representative Sanders, yield to a question.
He will yield. Representative Khan.
Representative Sanders, don't you think that this is, remember, this is not establishing it. This is not what I've tried to do in the past. Don't you think that getting some information about this and learning it and seeing what other states are doing and understanding that we might be missing out on $14 million a year is a useful thing to do?
The member from Minoka, Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Khan, it may very well be a very useful thing to do. I'd encourage you to draft a bill, and we'll run it through the committee process and see where we go.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Khan.
Well, Mr. Speaker and Representative Sanders, it's a little late for it now. This is the only way we can move it forward at this time. I don't recall if I've had a bill into your committee on this, but I certainly didn't have a chance to have a hearing on it.
Any further discussion on the A13 amendment? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of adoption of the A13 amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The motion does not prevail and the amendment is not adopted. There are no further amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File Number 2540, as amended.
Third reading. Discussion on House File 2540 as amended. Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 100 ayes and 28 nays, the bill is passed as amended and its title agreed to.